Aunt Lyra's hand struck both of her cheeks with such force that a searing sting spread through her skin, burning long after the slap had landed. Before she could react, Aunt Lyra's fingers twisted into her hair, yanking hard, refusing to let go. "Where's the money?" Aunt Lyra bellowed, her furious face just inches away. The girl winced, her scalp screaming from the relentless pull, her cheeks still throbbing from the blows. But the worst pain of all wasn't physical. It was the sight of her father standing there, silent, unmoving, as his new wife tormented her. "Hand over the money you stole," Aunt Lyra shrieked. "Ouch! I didn't take anything, Aunt Lyra," she cried, her voice trembling, desperate. "Please stop!" Aunt Lyra didn't listen. Instead, she yanked harder, then slammed the girl's head against the wall. The impact left her dazed, her vision blurring. "Don't lie to me! I'm not lying! I swear I didn't steal anything!" A sharp pain shot through her skull as Aunt Lyra wrenched her hair again. She let out a sob. "That's enough," her father finally ordered, but his voice was hollow, detached. He had waited too long enough for the bruises to start forming before he decided to speak. With a huff, Aunt Lyra shoved her to the floor. The girl barely caught herself before hitting the ground. She had no choice but to weep silently, curling into herself, her body aching as much as her heart. "Charles, warn your daughter!" Aunt Lyra snapped, turning to him with a scowl. "She's far too quick with her hands." Her father didn't argue. He never did. Aunt Lyra kept insisting the girl had stolen her money, but not a single coin was missing. She hadn't even stepped foot in Aunt Lyra's room. Yet the accusations stuck, clinging to her like a stain she couldn't wash off. Shakily, she rose to her feet and walked to her room, her body sore, her heart heavier than ever. She sank into a corner, pulling a framed photo to her chest. A memory from a time before Aunt Lyra, before the cruelty, before the house had stopped feeling like home. 4 months later, her father brought Aunt Lyra to live in the house permanently, along with her daughter Lucy, who was about the same age as the girl. For a brief moment, she had dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, things would get better. She was wrong. Aunt Lyra and Lucy treated her like a servant, forcing her to do all the housework while they lived in comfort. Some days they didn't even leave her food. An evening, after they had finished eating, she slipped out of her room, hoping, just hoping, there might be something left for her. The table was cluttered with dirty plates, but there was no food, only a few scattered grains of rice. "Thieves shouldn't be fed," Aunt Lyra said loudly, making sure she heard every word. She clenched her fists. When did they ever feed me, anyway? Even the dog was fed better than her. She wasn't just unwanted, she was treated worse than an animal. "Mom, she said something," Lucy tattled, her voice laced with delight. Lucy was always bold when their father wasn't around, but the moment he was present, she transformed into the perfect daughter, sweet and innocent. "Were you talking about me?" Aunt Lyra snapped, her eyes narrowing. The girl swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, I wasn't. Don't lie to me." Aunt Lyra's voice rose into a furious shout, her eyes burning with the promise of more punishment. The girl didn't shout back. She didn't even glare. She only thought to herself, "One day, Lucy, you'll get what's coming." "Ouch!" she cried out as Aunt Lyra seized her hair again, yanking so viciously that she lost her balance and collapsed onto the floor. "Get up!" Aunt Lyra snapped, her eyes blazing with anger. "I'm still furious about what you did." But before the girl could lift herself, Aunt Lyra's foot connected with her side, sending a fresh wave of pain coursing through her body. "Mom, that's what she deserves," Lucy chimed in, her laughter sharp and cruel. The girl clenched her fists against the cold tile floor. "One day, I'll get back at both of you." But now wasn't the time for vengeance. Now was the time for survival. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she pulled herself up and returned to the sink, finishing the dishes as if nothing had happened. Once the last plate was washed, she dried her hands quickly and slipped out of the house, her heart hammering as she made her way through the quiet streets. She knew exactly where to go. Lillian's house. The moment Lillian opened the door, the girl threw her arms around her, burying her face into her shoulder. Silent sobs racked her body. Lillian held her gently. "What happened?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Without another word, she led her inside and straight to the bedroom. She stepped away for a moment and returned with an ice pack. They both sighed. Lillian placed the ice gently against her friend's bruises. "You need to get out of that house." The girl let out a weak, humorless chuckle. "And where would I even go?" Come stay in Los Angeles, Lillian suggested. She shook her head. I have no money. I don't know anyone there. Lillian frowned, her grip on the ice pack tightening. We'll figure it out. Just hang in there, okay? I really feel sorry for you. If only we could report them to the police, but Aunt Lyra's brother is a cop. No one would listen. Tears welled in the girl's eyes, threatening to spill again. Lillian softened. Have you eaten? She shook her head and quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand. Let me check the kitchen, Lillian said, stepping away. The girl lay back on Lillian's soft bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts heavy. How had her life become this? Would she ever escape? A few minutes later, Lillian returned. All we had left were noodles and eggs, so I made you something. Thank you, the girl murmured, sitting up and eating quickly, as if she might not get another meal for a while. She didn't return home until she was sure Aunt Lyra and Lucy were asleep. If they saw her coming in late, they'd find an excuse to beat her again before bed. But sleep didn't last long. In the dead of night, she woke to the sound of raised voices. Her father and Aunt Lyra were arguing. How did you end up with such a big debt? Aunt Lyra's shrill voice cut through the darkness. Her father didn't answer. Aunt Lyra's tone grew sharper. How else? I lost while gambling, her father finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Lyra let out a sharp, disbelieving gasp. Oh my God! Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, suddenly, thud, something crashed against the floor. You promised me a comfortable life, not one full of problems, Aunt Lyra shouted, her voice trembling with rage. The girl sat up in bed, straining to hear every word. So Dad had a big debt. No wonder Aunt Lyra's furious. She pressed a hand to her forehead, glancing at the framed photo of her late mother. If only you were still alive, Mom. Dad had never been like this before. He never used to gamble, never used to drink. He had been a good man once, a hard-working man who came home every night, devoted to his family, devoted to Mom. But after she died, everything changed. He started drinking, stumbling in at odd hours with the heavy stench of alcohol clinging to him. His words slurred, his patience worn thin, and worst of all, he blamed her for Mom's death. It should have been you instead. She tried to stop him, tried to hold on to the father she once knew, but she had no power over him. No matter how much she wished for things to go back to the way they were, he had made it clear she was nothing but a reminder of what he had lost. Still, she clung to the love she had for him. He was her father. She wouldn't be alive if not for him. Eventually, the shouting died down. The house fell quiet again, and she lay back down, forcing herself to sleep. By morning, she was already up and out of the house, heading to the local market to help Mrs. Millionaire, the kind-hearted vendor who let her work on weekends. It wasn't much, but she earned $50 a day from Friday to Sunday. Plus, it came with meals, which was more than she could say about home. Anything specific you're looking for, sir? Ma'am, she called out, trailing behind a family browsing the merchandise. We have brand new flip-flops. The woman stopped, inspecting a pair. Do you have these in a size 6? Yes, ma'am, she replied quickly, gathering different sizes from the stock. A few minutes later, the woman decided to buy 3 pairs. That small success warmed her chest. At least here she could do something right. She had just finished lunch when a familiar, unwelcome voice cut through the market's hum. Do you have any money? She turned to see her father standing there, his eyes tired, his posture slumped. Her stomach twisted. No, Dad. His gaze hardened. What about your wages for today? I'm still on my shift. I haven't been paid yet, she said carefully, though what she really hated was the desperation in his voice. He turned to Mrs. Millionaire, who sighed sympathetically but still reached into her pocket, handing him some cash. The girl's heart sank. So that's it? I work and he takes it? They hardly fed her at home and now she couldn't even hold on to her own earnings. As he walked away, stuffing the money into his pocket, she forced a sad smile at Mrs. Millionaire, trying to ignore the lump in her throat. The older woman studied her for a moment, then sighed. If only your mother were alive. You'd probably be in college by now. That simple comment brought tears to the girl's eyes. Mrs. Millionaire understood, maybe more than anyone, just how difficult her life was. At least today she had managed to eat something. That evening she walked home with empty pockets, her stomach full but her heart unbearably heavy. Before heading back, she made a stop at Lillian's house. The moment she stepped inside, she spotted her friend hunched over a desk, lost in an assignment. Lillian had just returned from her college classes, something the girl once dreamed of attending, but now it felt like a distant fantasy. "How's school?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Lillian let out a deep sigh. "Tough. You can handle it," the girl said with a small smile, trying to encourage her. "It's for your future." Lillian returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, for both of our dreams." They had once shared the same dream, to become teachers, to stand in front of a classroom and change lives. But now that dream belonged solely to Lillian. The girl had long since fallen behind, her days consumed by survival, not studies. Lillian looked up, her expression soft. "When I graduate, I'll send you to school." The girl froze. "Don't worry about me," she murmured. "I've accepted my fate." "No way. Life can still turn around," Lillian said firmly. "I hope so." The girl swallowed hard. "I pray every night for things to change." Lillian reached over and squeezed her hand. "I pray for you too, every night. Thank you." While Lillian returned to her assignment, the girl absent-mindedly flipped through an English textbook lying on the desk. She traced the words with her fingers, reading passages she wished she could study properly, like Lillian did. Suddenly, the bedroom door swung open. "Hi, sis," Lillian gasped, then jumped from her chair. "Hey!" The newcomer was Theodore, Lillian's older brother, 7 years her senior. He worked as an architect in another city and only visited occasionally. The girl watched as Lillian rushed into his arms, hugging him tightly. A pang of something deep and unfamiliar twisted in her chest. What would it be like to have a sibling, someone who cared, who checked in, who asked how she was doing? Theodore glanced her way and gave a polite smile, nodding in greeting. She nodded back, feeling strangely out of place. Lillian grinned up at her brother. "So, what did you bring me?" "Check the—" Before he could finish, he playfully ruffled her hair, laughing as she swatted at his hands. He then strolled off toward the living room, leaving Lillian giggling. The girl stood, brushing off her dress. "I should get going, Lillian." Lillian turned to her, frowning. "Why not stay for dinner?" She shook her head gently. "I'm actually full. I'd rather go home and rest." Lillian gave her a knowing look, but didn't press. "All right, but come back tomorrow, okay?" They left the bedroom together, stepping into the warm glow of the living room where Lillian's mother was seated with a gentle smile. "Oh, going home already, dear? Why don't you stay for dinner?" Her voice was kind, inviting. The girl mustered a small smile. "It's okay, ma'am, I have to get back." As she stepped outside, she nearly bumped into Theodore. He was leaning against the porch railing, a cigarette between his fingers. At the sight of her, he quickly hid it behind his back, clearing his throat. "Heading home?" he asked, his voice steady, serious. She nodded, avoiding his gaze. Something about the way he looked at her always felt too intense, like he could see right through her. Without another word, she turned and walked away. When she arrived home, the familiar sound of raised voices greeted her. Aunt Lyra and her father were at it again? "You useless man! What kind of life is this?" Aunt Lyra shrieked. The girl froze for a moment, but it didn't take long for Aunt Lyra's attention to snap onto her instead. "And where have you been?" she demanded, eyes narrowing. Never mind," Aunt Lyra cut her off. "Go make dinner." Without protest, the girl obeyed. She moved quickly in the kitchen, preparing a meal she wouldn't even get to enjoy. Once she had served the food, she slipped away to shower, letting the warm water soothe the bruises that had yet to fade. Then she crawled into bed, knowing she'd have to wake early again to work at the market. The next day passed in much the same way. Another long shift, another small sum of money she never got to keep. By noon, Aunt Lyra arrived at the stall, snatching the cash straight from her hands under the excuse of needing groceries. Groceries the girl would never get to taste. Feeling defeated, she found herself walking toward Lillian's house before heading home. She wasn't sure if she was searching for comfort or just a distraction, but as soon as she stepped inside, she was caught off guard. Theodore and 2 of his friends were lounging in the living room, bottles of beer in hand. They seemed mid-conversation, but the moment she entered, the air shifted. Theodore's gaze locked onto her, steady and unreadable. His friends exchanged glances, clearing their throats, as if caught in something they shouldn't be doing. She quickly looked away, her face heating. It didn't help that his friends were handsome too. She already knew that Lillian had a hopeless crush on one of them, Elliot, the one with the easy smile and confident posture. "Theodore, where's Lillian?" she asked, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. "In her room," he answered, nodding toward the hallway. She murmured a thank you and hurried past them, feeling their eyes on her until she disappeared behind the bedroom door. Lillian looked up from her bed, immediately grinning. "Why are your cheeks so red?" she teased. The girl stammered, unable to find words fast enough. Lillian gasped in exaggerated shock. "Wait, don't tell me. I thought you said you didn't have a crush on my brother anymore." "I don't," she denied, a little too quickly. Lillian waggled her eyebrows. "Uh-huh. Sure, if he didn't have a girlfriend, I'd totally set you two up." "Stop saying stuff like that," the girl mumbled, looking away as she tried to hide her embarrassment. Lillian burst out laughing. Annoyed, the girl jabbed a finger into her side. "Hey!" Lillian only laughed harder. "Quiet, Lillian, they might hear us out there," the girl whispered, shooting her friend a warning look. Lillian stifled her laughter but still grinned mischievously. Fine, I won't tease you anymore," she relented. Then, after a beat, she smirked. "By the way, could you do this essay for me?" The girl gave her a flat look. "That's your assignment, Lillian. I know, but I'm stuck, and you're way better at writing than me," Lillian whined, clasping her hands together dramatically. "Please?" She even batted her eyelashes for extra effect. The girl scoffed. "Nice try." Lillian waggled her eyebrows. "If you do it, maybe my brother will give you a kiss." "You're so weird." The two of them burst into laughter. Lillian held up her hands in surrender. "But you want it." "No." She shook her head, but the corner of her lips twitched. "Uh-huh. Sure," Lillian said knowingly, then hopped off the bed. "I'm stepping out to grab some food. Be right back." The girl sighed and picked up Lillian's essay, skimming through it. It was pretty straightforward. Lillian just wanted an excuse to be lazy. A few minutes later, Lillian returned carrying a bag of chips and a soda, but her expression was different now, tense, almost annoyed. "Lucy's outside," she muttered. Both of them arched their brows. Of course Lucy was here. She had probably rushed over the moment she found out Theodore was back in town, batting her lashes and tossing her hair whenever she got the chance. Lillian sighed, plopping onto the bed. "That girl irritates me." "Me too," the girl muttered, setting the essay aside. "I wish I could make her and her mom move out." Lillian shook her head. "I'm definitely keeping an eye on her. She's not getting alone time with Theodore, especially if he's drinking. She might try to trap him," the girl snorted. "I highly doubt he'd go for Lucy. He has a gorgeous girlfriend, a flight attendant. Why would he trade that for her?" She rolled her eyes. "She goes through boyfriends faster than I go through a meal." But Lucy clearly wasn't giving up. Hours passed, and she still hadn't left, lingering in the living room like a stray cat waiting to pounce. It was obvious she was biding her time, waiting for Theodore to get drunk enough to make a move. The girl finally stepped out of Lillian's bedroom, stretching her arms. She wasn't expecting Lucy to notice her immediately. "Oh, Jasmine, you're here!" Lucy's voice was all honey and fake warmth, her bright smile practiced to perfection. Jasmine forced a polite nod, even as every fiber of her being wanted to roll her eyes. Lucy could be so fake as she returned home. The girl slowed her steps upon spotting Aunt Lyra at the front door, speaking in hushed tones with three unfamiliar men. "He's not here," Aunt Lyra told them sharply. "He went out." The men exchanged glances, their eyes scanning the dimly lit interior behind her. "Fine," one of them finally said, his voice carrying an edge. "Tell him he needs to pay what he owes, soon." With that, they turned away, but not before their gazes flicked toward the girl, lingering far too long. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed under their scrutinizing stares. Only when they disappeared down the street did she find her voice. "Aunt Lyra, who were those men?" "They're the people your father is indebted to," Aunt Lyra snapped impatiently. A lump formed in the girl's throat. "Where is he?" "How should I know?" Aunt Lyra huffed, waving a dismissive hand before stomping back inside. The girl hesitated before following. In the kitchen, she found her father hunched over the table, his fingers tangled in his disheveled hair. "What's happening, Dad?" she asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. He exhaled heavily before finally speaking. "Sweetheart, I need a large sum of money." Her stomach clenched. "How much?" "$500,000. Her breath hitched. $500,000? Dad, where would we even get that kind of money? I barely make $150 a day at the market. She searched his face, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but all she saw was exhaustion and quiet desperation. Before he could answer, Aunt Lyra waltzed in, arms crossed. Why don't we just sell the house? Dad stiffened. No, this place is all we have. Really? Aunt Lyra scoffed. So you'd rather let those loan sharks kill you? Because that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't pay up. We aren't selling this house, Dad shot back. If we did, where would we live? Their bickering escalated, filling the kitchen with tense voices that made the girl's head pound. She pressed her hands against her temples, trying to block them out. Fear twisted in her gut. What would happen to them if Dad couldn't pay? Feeling sick, she slipped away to her room and curled beneath the thin blanket, squeezing her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. The next morning, she woke to hushed voices drifting from the kitchen. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she stepped toward the door, then froze. Aunt Lyra's voice was low but clear. Mr. Donovan really likes Jasmine. If you can get her to agree, our problems are solved. Her heart stopped. A sickening wave of dread washed over her. She waited, clinging to a fragile hope that her father would shut the idea down, that he would stand up for her. But he said nothing, not a single word. Her hands trembled. A hollow, sinking feeling spread through her chest as she turned and walked out the door, her mind reeling. They were plotting something terrible. They never showed up at the market that day. The girl kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Aunt Lyra's sharp glare or her father's slumped figure approaching. But neither of them came. The absence only confirmed her worst fears. By the time her shift ended, her nerves were frayed. With nowhere else to turn, she made her way to Lillian's house. Lillian was already outside, as if she had been waiting. Her eyes narrowed with concern the moment she saw the girl's face. Theodore and one of his friends were in the living room, casually lounging, their laughter drifting through the open window. Clearly, they were home on vacation. The girl barely paid them any attention. She stepped closer to Lillian, her voice barely above a whisper. I have something to tell you. Lillian frowned. What is it? You look upset. Their eyes met, and for a moment the girl hesitated, but she had to say it. She swallowed hard and murmured, Dad and Aunt Lyra planned to sell me to Mr. Donovan. Lillian's reaction was immediate and loud. What? The girl flinched and grabbed Lillian's arm. Shoo, she pleaded. Lillian's face paled. How do you know? She asked, her voice shaky. I heard them talking this morning, the girl admitted, her hands trembling. Dad owes $500,000 to some dangerous people. He refuses to sell the house, so Aunt Lyra suggested selling me instead. And the worst part? He's actually considering it. Her throat tightened as tears welled up. I'm scared, Lillian. I don't know what to do. Lillian reached for her, rubbing slow circles on her back. We have to think of a plan, she said firmly. Before they could continue, the bedroom door swung open. The Andol stood there, his usual unreadable expression in place. Have some snacks, he said, nodding toward the table. Lillian rolled her eyes. Later, Theodore, we're busy. He ignored her annoyance. I ordered food. Grab some in the kitchen if you want, he said casually before walking away. The girl exhaled shakily as Lillian muttered, such a nuisance. The girl managed a faint, tired smile. Lillian wasted no time, setting the food aside and turning back to her. Jasmine, you have no choice. You have to run away. The girl felt a dull ache in her chest. Run where? I don't have money, Lillian. I'll think of something tonight, Lillian promised. But in the meantime, you need to be careful. Lock your doors and windows. If you feel unsafe, don't hesitate, just leave. She nodded, though fear still gnawed at her. As evening fell, she returned home, her stomach twisting in knots. Inside, she found Dad and Aunt Lyra deep in conversation. Their voices quieted the moment she stepped in. Her father's gaze softened in an unfamiliar way. Sweetheart, come here, he said. Her heart pounded as she hesitated. Aunt Lyra's eyes gleamed as she watched her closely. Swallowing her fear, the girl took slow, cautious steps forward. I talked to Mr. Donovan, Dad began. The girl clenched her fists under the table, her body going rigid. A slow, burning rage swelled in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. And? She asked, her voice taut with restraint. He's willing to cover my debt, Dad continued. Her stomach twisted. The air around her felt suffocating. In exchange for what? She asked, even though she already knew the answer. Dad hesitated for only a moment before saying, You know he's interested in you. He wants you to marry him." A cold shudder ran through her. She shook her head instantly. "I don't want that!" "What?" Aunt Lyra snapped, already raising her hand to strike, but before she could, Dad caught her wrist, stopping her. "Sweetheart, please," he pleaded. "You're my only hope. Do you have any idea what this could mean for you? A big house? Financial security? He's old. When he passes, you'll inherit something." She stared at him in disbelief, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "Money isn't everything, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with something dangerously close to heartbreak. "I won't do it." She turned away, refusing to hear more. Behind her, Aunt Lyra seethed, her voice sharp with fury, but Dad only sighed. "Leave her be. She's just in shock. She'll come around." No, she wouldn't. At night, sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with fear, rage, and desperation. By 9 o'clock, she could take it no longer. Slipping out of bed, she quietly pushed open the window and climbed out into the night. The road to Lillian's house was dimly lit, shadows stretching long under the weak glow of street lamps. When she arrived, Theodore and his friends were still in the yard, drinks in hand, their laughter cutting through the quiet evening otherwise chaotic. Elliot spotted her first. "Oh, Jasmine, it's late," he called out, his voice laced with curiosity. She forced a small, strained smile. "I need to talk to Lillian." Theodore gave her a slight nod, and she quickly slipped past them, easing inside the house. "Lillian?" she whispered, careful not to wake Lillian's mother. A moment later, Lillian emerged from her room, eyes widening when she saw the expression on the girl's face. "Jasmine, what's wrong?" she asked, concern deepening her voice. The girl took a shaky breath. "I've been thinking. I need to leave my house." Lillian's brows knit together. "You're running away?" She nodded. "Yes, but I need money first, and I have an idea." Lillian's face darkened instantly. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Remember you said some of your classmates work at—" "No," Lillian interrupted, her voice shaking. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "I won't let you do that." The girl felt her own vision blur. "I don't have another choice, Lillian. Do you really think letting my dad sell me to that old man would be better?" Her voice cracked. "It's just one time. Please, introduce me to your classmate who knows about that business." Lillian went silent, her lips pressed into a tight line. Seconds dragged into minutes. The girl watched her, desperation clawing at her chest. "Lillian," she whispered, "please. This is the only way I can think of to escape with some money to survive," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't just run off with nothing at all." The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, and before she realized it, sleep overtook her. She woke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the curtains. The room was quiet except for the faint sniffles beside her. Blinking groggily, she turned to see Lillian, already awake, her eyes swollen from crying. "Meet me this afternoon outside my school," Lillian said in a trembling voice. "Do you have enough for the bus?" She nodded. Lillian exhaled shakily. "Okay then, I feel awful, Jasmine. I don't want you to be in danger." "You're helping me. Thank you," Jasmine whispered, her throat tight with emotion. She fought back the sting of tears. In silence, they made their way to the kitchen, where Lillian's mother was already preparing breakfast. "Eat up, honey," Lillian's mom said warmly, placing a plate in front of her. Jasmine murmured her thanks, swallowing past the lump in her throat. As she ate, she realized with a pang of sorrow that this might be the last time she'd sit at this table. The last time she'd share a meal with Lillian and her mother. She wanted to hold on to this moment, but reality pulled her forward. After breakfast, she returned home, moving quietly, careful not to draw attention. In her small, worn-out bag, she packed the few clothes she owned and tucked it under her arm. Then, with a deep breath, she slipped out of the house before her father or Aunt Lyra could notice. At the market, she worked her shift as usual, her bag hidden behind the stall. She was almost done for the day when her father showed up. "Where's your pay?" he demanded, his sharp eyes scanning her. Jasmine wordlessly handed over the money she had made, feeling the now familiar sting of resentment. As if the day couldn't get worse, a familiar figure entered the market. "Mr. Donovan," he strode toward her with a smug expression, his gaze lingering far too long. "You'll be mine soon, Jasmine," he said, his voice laced with certainty. Her stomach twisted, but she met his eyes and muttered under her breath, "Never." Her heart pounded wildly as he walked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a vice. By 5 in the afternoon, she was on the bus, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. When she arrived at Lillian's school, she spotted her friend standing near the entrance, accompanied by a woman Jasmine had never seen before, Charlene. Dressed impeccably, from her manicured nails to the designer bag slung over her arm, Charlene scanned Jasmine from head to toe. "That her?" Charlene asked, arching a brow. Lillian nodded stiffly. Charlene tilted her head. "She'll look even better once she's fixed up." Jasmine swallowed, feeling suddenly exposed under Charlene's scrutinizing gaze. They headed to a small coffee shop nearby where Charlene pulled out her phone. "I need to send your photo to my manager," she said matter-of-factly, raising the camera. Jasmine forced herself to sit still as the flash went off. "I told him you're a virgin," Charlene added casually. Jasmine flinched, but she said nothing. Minutes passed in silence, tension thick between them as they waited for the response. Then, Charlene's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen and smirked. "All right, we have a booking," she announced. "We're heading to the city." Jasmine's fingers clenched around her cup. "Do you have another outfit?" Charlene asked. Lillian let out a sigh, then reached into her bag and pulled out a red dress. "Here," she said, handing it over. Jasmine took it carefully, knowing how much Lillian hated this. Yet, despite her disapproval, she was still here, still helping. "I'm coming with you," Lillian declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. Charlene rolled her eyes but didn't protest. The ride to the city stretched over an hour, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on Jasmine like a storm cloud. There was no turning back, now. They arrived at an upscale restaurant, the air thick with the scent of grilled meats and expensive perfume. Seated in a quiet corner, they met Madame Ruby, Charlene's so-called manager. "We'll wait for the client to confirm," Madame Ruby said, her voice smooth but authoritative. Jasmine swallowed hard, hands clenched beneath the table. Her nerves buzzed, but she forced herself to focus. This had to work. There was no other option. She was already dressed and made up, her face dusted with soft powders, lips painted a shade deeper than she was used to. Charlene and Lillian had helped transform her. She barely recognized the girl staring back at her from the car window earlier. The minutes crawled by. Then, 20 minutes into the wait, Madame Ruby's phone chimed. She glanced at the screen and smirked. "He sent my cut," she announced, slipping her phone back into her bag. "He's at the hotel." Lillian's breath hitched. As they stepped out of the car, she clutched Jasmine's hand tightly. "I'll walk her in," she started, but Charlene cut her off with a sharp glare. "That's not how this works," Charlene snapped. Lillian ignored her. She grabbed Jasmine's wrist, pressing a crumpled note into her palm. "Here's my number," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't ever forget me." Jasmine's chest tightened. Their goodbye felt endless, like neither wanted to let go. "Thank you, Lillian," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "Take care." Lillian nodded, blinking back tears. Jasmine forced herself to turn away, walking toward the hotel entrance with leaden feet. She could still feel Lillian's gaze on her back. Inside, she approached the reception desk. "Yes, ma'am?" the receptionist asked politely. "Room 303, under the name Rose," she murmured, barely able to get the words out. That was the alias Madame Ruby had given her. The receptionist nodded, dialing a number. After a brief exchange, she hung up. "All set, ma'am. You may proceed." Jasmine's pulse pounded in her ears as she made her way to the elevator. The ride to the third floor felt both too fast and agonizingly slow. When she reached room 303, she hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she raised a hand to knock, but the door wasn't locked. It creaked open under the slightest pressure. Inside, the room was dimly lit, pristine white sheets stretched across the king-sized bed. Another door, slightly ajar, led to the ensuite bathroom. The distant rush of running water echoed within. The client was showering. Jasmine exhaled shakily. Moving quickly, she placed her small sack of clothes inside a cabinet near the entrance, tucking it away like she could somehow hide the truth of what she was about to do. Then she waited. Minutes stretched endlessly. Her stomach churned. Then the water stopped. Her breath hitched. A few moments later, the bathroom door opened, releasing a curl of steam into the room. She lowered her gaze to the floor, staring at a pair of bare feet stepping past her. "Are we starting now, or do you want to shower first?" The deep voice struck her like a lightning bolt. Familiar. Too familiar? Her heart stopped. Slow. Her head lifted. Her breath caught in her throat. Her world spun. Theodore? Her voice cracked on the name. Her best friend Lillian's older brother, the boy she had secretly liked for years, stood before her. He was the client. Didn't he have a girlfriend? Why would he even be here, hiring someone? Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her mind struggling to process the moment. You? Theodore's voice was laced with the same disbelief. His dark brows knit together as he ran a hand through his damp hair, ruffling it in frustration. His jaw tensed before he muttered, "You can still walk away." His words hung in the air like an open door she was too afraid to step through. Walk away? And go where? Back home, where her father had practically sold her off? Back to nothing? She swallowed the knot in her throat and forced herself to answer. "I'll shower." Without another glance in his direction, she turned and rushed into the bathroom, shutting the door behind her. Heat flooded her cheeks, a mixture of shame and confusion burning beneath her skin. She leaned against the sink, gripping its edges, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with too many emotions to name. What was she doing? Taking a shaky breath, she peeled off her dress and stepped under the hot spray of water, letting it cascade over her like it could wash away everything. Her past, her fears, the situation she'd just found herself in. Scrubbing every inch of her skin, she used even the thin fabric of her underwear to ensure she felt completely clean, as if that would somehow make a difference. Then, suddenly, the number flashed in her mind. 0.9. The price placed on her first time. A sharp knock rattled the bathroom door. Once, twice, 3 times. "You almost done?" Theodore's voice called out, slightly impatient. "I'm getting tired of waiting." Her heart pounded. "I'm done," she replied, though she barely recognized her own voice. Steeling herself, she grabbed a towel, pressing it against her skin as she squeezed the excess water from her hair. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. When she finally emerged, Theodore was standing by the window, bathed in the dim golden glow of the city lights filtering through the glass. He was scrolling on his phone, seemingly indifferent, but the tension in his stance told another story. She hesitated, then cleared her throat. At the sound, he set his phone down and turned to face her. For a moment, it was just like all the other times, those quiet afternoons at Lillian's house, when she'd catch him watching her from across the room, holding her gaze a second longer than necessary. Only now, there was no friendly distance between them. She bit her lip, unsure of what to say, before her eyes landed on the bottle on the table. "Is that beer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, watching her closely. "Can I have some?" The corner of his mouth lifted in amusement. "You owe me that much." Before she could respond, he took a step closer. She stiffened, but didn't move away. Gently, he lifted her chin with his fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. The playful smirk lingered on his lips, but something deeper lurked in his dark eyes, something unreadable. "You're really beautiful, Jasmine," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. Then, before she could react, his lips brushed against hers. Soft at first, hesitant, as if waiting for her to pull away, but she didn't. Her arms instinctively draped around his shoulders, her body responding before her mind could catch up. The kiss deepened, growing desperate, urgent, as his hands explored the shape of her, drawing her closer. For a moment, she let herself forget. Forget the reason she was here, forget the weight of her choices, forget everything except the warmth of his touch, the way he felt against her, the quiet hum of desire igniting between them. But then he carefully laid her down against the bed. Hovering over her, Theodore gazed at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then he kissed her again, and this time she let herself fall. Theodore made love to her again and again, until exhaustion finally overtook him. His breathing was heavy, his body warm against hers, lingering in the aftermath of their shared intimacy. Before pulling away, he pressed one last, lingering kiss to her lips. Soft, almost reluctant. Then, without a word, he pushed himself off the bed, reaching for his jacket draped over the sofa. From the inner pocket, he retrieved a thick brown envelope. "I added a little extra," he murmured, tossing it onto the bed beside her. She stared at the envelope, her fingers tightening around the sheets. The weight of reality came crashing down all at once. Theodore had already turned away, heading toward the bathroom. At the doorway, he hesitated, glancing at her one last time. For a fleeting moment, she thought he might say something. Anything but instead, he walked inside and shut the door behind him. A cold wave of finality settled over her. Without wasting another second, she shoved back the covers and scrambled out of bed. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the envelope, feeling the thickness of the bills inside. She forced herself to move quickly. Crossing the room in a hurry, she yanked open the cabinet where she had stashed her sack of clothes. With shaking hands, she pulled on her dress, stuffing the envelope securely into her bag. Then, without looking back, she slipped out of the hotel room and into the dimly lit hallway. Her heartbeat drummed loudly in her ears as she made her way outside, every step fueled by a sense of urgency. The evening air was crisp against her flushed skin. A tricycle happened to be parked by the curb. She flagged it down, her voice barely steady as she gave the driver instructions. Within minutes, she was speeding toward the bus terminal, bound for a city where no one knew her name. And just like that, she disappeared. 1 month later, Jasmine had built a new life for herself, one far away from the suffocating grasp of her father, the cruelty of Aunt Lyra, and the shadow of the past she left behind. She had done it. She had escaped, but now she faced an entirely different reality, one that left her breathless, terrified, and overwhelmed. She was pregnant, and the child growing inside her was Theodore's. She had spent the past month carefully managing the $200,000 he had given her, using it as a foundation to carve out a future. With a portion of the money, she had opened a small store, selling breakfast items and snacks to cover her rent, utilities, and daily expenses. The rest she had tucked safely away in a bank account, reserved for the tiny life she now carried. Some nights she sat alone in her little apartment, staring at the walls, feeling both grateful and lost. Grateful that she was no longer alone, lost because she had no idea how to raise a child by herself. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss." Blinking, she turned toward the small service window of her store. A customer stood there, waiting patiently. "What can I get for you?" she asked, brushing away the heavy thoughts clouding her mind. "Soft drinks, please," the buyer replied. She nodded, grabbing a cold bottle from the crate. Her shop had quickly become a staple in the crowded neighborhood where she lived. The streets were always alive with movement, neighbors chatting, children playing, vendors calling out their daily specials. It was noisy, but it was also the reason her business thrived. She kept the store open until 9 each night, but now that she was pregnant, she considered extending her hours until midnight, anything to earn a little extra before the baby arrived. She had cut ties with everyone from her past. She hadn't heard from Lillian, though she couldn't blame her friend for staying silent. After everything that happened, she was too ashamed to reach out. As for Theodore, she had no idea what became of him. Did he even wonder where she had gone? Did he regret what happened? Or had she been nothing more than a transaction, long forgotten the moment she left? It was better not to think about it. She had no desire to know what had become of her father and Aunt Lyra either. After all the suffering they had put her through, she had learned to stop caring. The next morning, she made her way to the community health center for a checkup. The midwife listened carefully, then advised her to go to the hospital for an ultrasound to confirm the baby's health. With a quiet nod, she left, stopping by a pharmacy to purchase the prenatal vitamins the doctor recommended. She also bought fresh milk and fruit, determined to give her child the best start she could manage. As she walked home, cradling the small bag of essentials, she placed a protective hand over her stomach. It wasn't just about her anymore. From now on, every choice, every decision was for the tiny life growing inside her. And no matter what it took, she would find a way to give her child a better life than the one she had been given. On her way back home, Jasmine passed Mrs. Nita, who stood outside her small house, stirring a pot over an open fire. The savory aroma of simmering broth filled the air, blending with the faint scent of wood smoke. "Jasmine, you didn't sell breakfast today?" Mrs. Nita asked, glancing up from her cooking. Jasmine shook her head, offering a small, tired smile. "I went for a checkup, Mom." Mrs. Nita wiped her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes narrowing with concern. "Are you sick?" "No," Jasmine replied softly, her fingers instinctively resting against her stomach. "I'm pregnant." Mrs. Nita's eyes widened in surprise. "Pregnant, and where's the father?" Jasmine hesitated for only a second before forcing a little smile. "He passed away." It was a lie, but a necessary one. She could already imagine the storm of gossip if people found out the truth, that the father of her child was a man who had never truly been hers to begin with. Mrs. Nita sighed, shaking her head. "That's sad, child, but such is life. You're strong. You can raise that baby on your own. Just trust in God, and He will provide." Jasmine nodded, grateful that the older woman didn't press further. Mrs. Nita had a reputation for being a neighborhood gossip, but she was also deeply religious. Perhaps in her own way, she meant well. "Yes, Mom," Jasmine said gently. "I'll open my store now. I'll be selling snacks later in the evening." "That's good," Mrs. Nita gave an approving nod. "I'll come hang out there so you won't get bored." Jasmine chuckled softly, thanking her before heading off. Later that afternoon, as soon as Jasmine unlocked her store's front window, a familiar face appeared. Olivia, a neighbor, strolled over, her baby bump visible beneath her loose blouse. "Hey, Jasmine, got any cold drinks?" Olivia asked, fanning herself. Of course, Jasmine handed her a chilled bottle, then hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Olivia, can I ask you something?" "Sure," Olivia said, twisting off the bottle cap. "Where do you get your prenatal checkups?" Olivia took a sip before answering. "I go into the city to see an OB. She's good, but it cost about $200 per visit." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. That was expensive, but it was worth it to ensure her baby was healthy. "Do you mind if I come with you next week?" she asked, a little shyly. A warm smile spread across Olivia's face. "Of course. Wait, are you pregnant too?" Jasmine nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "That's great news," Olivia beamed. "We can go together. It's always better to have company." And just like that, Jasmine and Olivia became friends. Over time, they confided in each other, sharing bits and pieces of their pasts. One evening, as they sat outside Jasmine's store, Olivia admitted something that had clearly weighed on her heart. "I used to work in a nightclub," she confessed, her voice quiet but steady. "That's how I met Giulio. He's a businessman and a married man." Jasmine listened without judgment. "He helped me financially, at least. He even gave me money for this pregnancy." Olivia let out a dry laugh. "But, of course, he could never take real responsibility." Jasmine reached out and gave her friend's hand a comforting squeeze. Then one day, she found Olivia crying. "What's wrong?" Jasmine asked, worried. Olivia sniffled, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Giulio's wife found out about me," she whispered, her voice shaking. Jasmine's stomach twisted with unease. "What happened?" Olivia took a shuddering breath. "She threatened to have us arrested if we don't end things." Jasmine's heart ached for her friend. She understood all too well what it felt like to be trapped in a situation where every choice seemed wrong. But what could she say? Some wounds had no easy remedy. "What about child support?" Jasmine asked, her voice laced with concern. Olivia let out a weary sigh, her fingers tracing circles on the worn-out table. "It's gone. He hasn't sent me anything." Her voice was hollow, edged with quiet resignation. Jasmine's heart ached for her friend. Olivia had already been struggling, and now, without financial support, things would only get harder. "You can stay with me," Jasmine offered without hesitation. "Save your rent money for the baby's delivery." Olivia looked up, startled. "Are you sure?" "Of course. We'll figure it out together." And just like that, they became each other's lifeline. They spent their days cooking and selling food, ignoring the whispers from neighbors who branded them as mistresses. But Jasmine refused to let the gossip shake her. Only God knew the real story. Underscore 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 underscore. One hot afternoon, Jasmine stood behind the counter assembling a glass of Halo with careful precision. The crushed ice melted too fast in the heat, and she worked quickly, layering the sweet ingredients. "Olivia, bring the skewers, please," she called over her shoulder. "On my way." Olivia's voice rang from the back. Their small food stall brought in just enough to survive, but it was still a struggle. Then, in the blink of an eye, Olivia gave birth, leaving Jasmine to manage the store alone. At first, Olivia tried to help, But Jasmine wouldn't let her. "You need to rest," she insisted, shooing her away. "Postnatal recovery is important." But, no buts. "By God's grace, we'll get through this." And they did. Then Jasmine gave birth too. Holding her newborn son in her arms, she felt an overwhelming wave of love, mixed with a deep, aching longing. Dominic, that was what she named him. He had Theodore's eyes, and the more he grew, the more she saw his father in him, especially when he frowned, his tiny features forming the same serious expression. She smiled down at him, brushing a gentle hand over his soft cheek. "You look so handsome, son," she whispered. Beside her, Olivia's baby, Sander, slept peacefully. Jasmine glanced at the little boy and murmured a silent prayer for Olivia's safety. At night, while her children slept, Jasmine kept working. She prepared ice candies to sell the next day, pushing past exhaustion because she had no choice. A year later, time passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless responsibilities. Jasmine often found herself lost in thought, wondering about Theodore. Had he married his girlfriend? Did he ever think of her? She never reached out. But her feelings for him hadn't faded. In fact, after giving birth to his child, they had only grown stronger. Sometimes she caught herself daydreaming about introducing Dominic to him. She imagined the look on Theodore's face. Would he recognize his own son? Would he care? Then one day, reality struck like a bolt of lightning. Dominic fell ill. His tiny body burned with fever, his breathing grew weak, and his skin paled to a frightening degree. Jasmine rushed him to the hospital, heart pounding with terror. The doctor's words shattered her world. "Your baby needs a blood transfusion." Jasmine's hands trembled as she clutched Dominic close, pressing frantic kisses to his forehead. Olivia, who had left Sander with a neighbor, stayed by her side. She even skipped work at the nightclub, refusing to leave Jasmine alone. But Jasmine was falling apart. Her son's cries were weak, his tiny fists barely moving. She had never felt so powerless in her life. And in that moment, one thought consumed her. Would Theodore ever know that their son was fighting for his life? "Don't cry," Olivia murmured, wrapping an arm around Jasmine's trembling shoulders. But no words could comfort a mother on the verge of losing her child. Jasmine clung to her friend, her nails digging into Olivia's sleeve as she fought back the overwhelming terror surging through her. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, the hum of distant monitors only amplifying her dread. They waited for the blood test results, their breaths shallow, their prayers silent. "Please God, please God." A nurse finally returned with a clipboard in hand. "The baby's blood type is AB negative." Jasmine's heart sank. She was O positive. Olivia was AB negative, but she couldn't donate. She had just given birth months ago. Then came the devastating news. The hospital's blood bank has no supply of AB negative at the moment, the nurse informed them. "It's a rare type. You need to find a donor." Panic tightened around Jasmine's chest like a vice. A donor? But who? The nurse's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Where is the baby's father?" Jasmine froze. She met Olivia's gaze, an unspoken conversation passing between them. There was no time for pride, no time for hesitation. Dominic's life was at stake. She had no choice but to go to Theodore. Jasmine barely remembered the ride to her old home county. The world outside the taxi window blurred as she clutched her hands together, whispering frantic prayers. "I'm sorry, Theodora. I don't want to disrupt your life, but I have to do this for our child." Her heart pounded as she arrived at the familiar address, only to find herself staring at an unfamiliar sight. The once modest home had been transformed into a grand, 4-story mansion, its polished windows reflecting the golden afternoon light. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Did he still live here? Had he moved on completely? Steeling herself, she rang the doorbell. Once, twice, 3 times. Minutes passed before an older woman opened the gate. She wasn't Lillian's mother, which sent a ripple of unease through Jasmine. "Is Mrs. Almira here?" Jasmine asked, gripping the strap of her bag. The woman gave a polite but puzzled smile. "She's overseas with Miss Lillian. Mr. Theodore is here, though. He's in a meeting." Jasmine exhaled, relief and anxiety warring inside her. "He was here. Please," she said, her voice barely steady. "I need to speak with Theodore. It's urgent." Perhaps it was the desperation in her eyes or the sheer sincerity of her tone, but the woman nodded and led her inside. As Jasmine stepped into the house, her gaze darted around, searching. Photos, signs of a wife, a family, but there were none. Only sleek furniture, pristine decor, and silence. She perched on the edge of the couch, twisting her hands, every minute stretching unbearably long. 5 minutes, then 10. Every second counted. Dominic needed blood now, then footsteps. She turned just as Elliot entered the room, his eyes widening in shock. "Jasmine?" His voice carried disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't need to explain, he could see it on her face. Elliot didn't waste a second. "I'll talk to Theodore. Wait here." He disappeared up the stairs, moving fast. Jasmine pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady the wild beating of her heart. Then, footsteps echoed again. But this time, it wasn't Elliot. A woman descended the staircase. Tall, elegant, model-like beauty. She didn't spare Jasmine a glance. Jasmine swallowed hard. Had Theodore married her? Was she about to walk into a life that no longer had a place for her? Then, Elliot reappeared at the top of the stairs and met her gaze. He didn't speak, just gave her a slight nod and gestured for her to come up. She nearly tripped in her haste. Her pulse roared in her ears as she reached the second floor. Elliot pointed to a brown door. Behind that door was Theodore, and her child's fate rested in his hands. Jasmine hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. She stepped into what appeared to be a study, a grand, imposing space lined with towering bookshelves. The scent of aged paper and polished wood filled the air. A large mahogany desk stood in the center, its surface meticulously arranged save for a single crystal tumbler half filled with whiskey. Behind it sat Theodore. The moment their eyes met, a chill swept through her. He leaned back in his leather swivel chair, his face unreadable, but the sharp glint in his gaze cut through her like ice. "Theodore," she breathed, forcing herself forward despite the trembling in her knees. Her voice wavered. "I need your help." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she fought them back. She had no time for hesitation, no room for fear. Theodore didn't move, didn't flinch. His hands remained folded on the desk, his expression impassive. Then, after a long, cold silence, he spoke. "You need money?" His tone was devoid of emotion. Jasmine shook her head, swallowing hard. "Your child needs you," she whispered. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, crackling with unspoken truths. "He has a serious condition and needs your blood. Please, please have mercy on our son." For the first time, Theodore stirred, his fingers unfurled, his brows knit together. "What did you just say?" "We have a child," she said, her voice barely above a breath. His gaze darkened. "A child," she nodded. "Yes, our night together. It led to a pregnancy." Theodore shot up from his chair so suddenly that she flinched. "And you never told me?" His voice was dangerously low, simmering with fury. Jasmine clenched her fists. "Please, can we talk about that later? Right now our son needs you. His condition is critical." Whatever emotion had been brewing in Theodore's eyes vanished. His expression hardened into resolve. Without another word, he yanked open a drawer, grabbed his wallet and keys, then turned to her. "Let's go." Before she could react, he seized her wrist, pulling her toward the door with urgent strides. The moment they stepped out into the hallway, Elliot was already there, waiting. "Can you drive us?" Theodore asked briskly. Elliot's brows furrowed. "Where to?" Jasmine barely found her voice. "St. Joseph's Hospital." Elliot's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. He turned and hurried ahead of them. As they descended the grand staircase, the housekeeper rushed toward them, phone in hand. "Sir, your mother is on the line." Theodore didn't even slow down. "Tell her I can't talk now." His grip on Jasmine's wrist remained firm, steady, as if letting go wasn't an option, and he led her straight to the waiting car. Once inside, Theodore turned to her, his voice quieter but no less intense. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Jasmine swallowed past the lump in her throat. "A boy." His jaw tensed. "What's his name?" "Theodore Jr.," Jasmine said softly. Theodore's gaze sharpened. "His last name?" A quiet sigh escaped her lips. "Gomez," she admitted. His jaw tightened. "Not mine?" Jasmine lowered her eyes, her fingers gripping the hem of her blouse. "You need the father's signature for that, right?" She swallowed hard. "I was scared to contact you." Theodore let out a slow exhale, his expression unreadable. "I see. You left without saying anything." There was an accusation in his voice, but she didn't have the strength to argue. Her mind was consumed by worry for Dominic Elliott, who had been quiet until now, muttered under his breath. "Calm down, man. She's frantic enough." The car screeched to a halt in front of the hospital. Theodore wasted no time. He jumped out, leaving the door swinging open behind him. Inside, the doctors moved swiftly, preparing for the transfusion. Jasmine could only watch, hands clasped together in silent prayer, as Theodore rolled up his sleeve without hesitation. His blood was a match. As the transfusion began, he moved to the crib, his towering figure somehow shrinking in the presence of the fragile infant. With careful hands, he reached down and pressed a tender kiss to his son's tiny foot. His eyes shut for a long moment. When he opened them again, they were red. "You'll be fine, son. Daddy's here." His voice was a whisper, thick with emotion. Jasmine turned away, blinking rapidly. She hadn't expected to see this side of him. Just then, Olivia tugged at her sleeve, breaking the moment. "I'll head home, okay? I left my baby with the neighbor." Jasmine nodded, exhausted but grateful. "Thanks for being with me." Olivia smirked, her voice teasing. "Your son's dad is really handsome." Jasmine's eyes widened and she lightly smacked Olivia's arm. "Not the time." Olivia only laughed, waving as she disappeared down the hall. By nightfall, Dominic's condition had improved. Theodore made arrangements to transfer him to a private room, ensuring he had the best care possible. When Dominic woke up crying for milk, Jasmine instinctively reached for him, adjusting her blouse to nurse. She glanced up and froze. Theodore was watching. A sudden heat crept up her neck. She shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "Thank you." He lifted an eyebrow. "For what?" "For helping us." Her voice came out awkward, unsure. Theodore studied her for a moment before leaning back against the wall. "Is anyone looking for you at home?" His tone was casual, but there was something underneath, something sharp. Her stomach twisted. She didn't know how to ask the one question gnawing at her. "Is there someone waiting for you? A wife? A fiancé?" She averted her gaze, pretending she hadn't heard. A beat of silence passed before Theodore cleared his throat. "I'll get you something to eat. Do you want anything special?" Jasmine fumbled for her wallet. "Just fried chicken and iced tea, maybe." His frown deepened, as if her request somehow annoyed him. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving her with the quiet hum of the monitors and the steady rise and fall of Dominic's tiny chest. Jasmine cradled Dominic against her chest, pressing a soft kiss to his tiny forehead. His warm little body felt safe in her arms, his breathing steady now, a far cry from the terrifying moments at the hospital earlier. She traced a gentle finger over his delicate features, marveling at how much he resembled his father. "You look so much like your dad," she murmured, her voice full of quiet wonder. "Not a bit of my face in you, huh?" She chuckled softly, relieved beyond words that he was doing better. But even as she smiled, a pang of guilt tightened in her chest. "I'm sorry, sweetie, for letting this happen to you," she whispered, pressing another kiss to his temple. Just then, the door swung open and Theodore stepped inside. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of men followed, their arms full of grocery bags. Jasmine blinked in surprise as they filed in, carrying diapers, milk, fresh fruit, and an assortment of food. One of them, a tall man with an easygoing smile, stepped forward. "Hello, Jasmine," he greeted warmly, leaning in slightly, as if about to kiss her cheek. Before he could get close, Theodore's arm shot out, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him back. "Hey!" Ford yelped, his eyes widening in surprise. A burst of laughter erupted from another man in the group. Richard, if Jasmine remembered correctly. He crossed his arms, smirking. "He's jealous," Richard said, his tone dripping with amusement. Jasmine's cheeks flamed with heat. Theodore shot his friends a dark glare. "Cut it out, relax, man," Ford said, adjusting his collar. "We just got here. We brought groceries for your kid." "Fine, but now you can all leave," Theodore snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. Richard let out a low whistle. "Is that how you treat us now that you've found Jasmine again? You don't need us anymore, huh?" Theodore rolled his eyes, but his friends weren't done. "That baby looks exactly like you, Theodore," one of them quipped, a mischievous grin on his face. "Must have been quite a night you two had." Laughter echoed around the room. Theodore clenched his jaw, his expression unreadable, but Jasmine felt her stomach twist in mortification. "I'm just saying maybe she didn't enjoy it at all," another friend teased. Theodore's expression darkened instantly. "Enough," he growled. "Get out." His friends only laughed harder, clearly enjoying his irritation. "We'll drop by again tomorrow to visit Jasmine and baby Theodore Dominic," one of them announced. Theodore scowled. "Don't bother. We're not here for you, man," they shot back, grinning. "We're here for Jasmine and baby Dominic." With that, they finally strolled out, still chuckling amongst themselves. The door shut behind them, and the room was suddenly too quiet. Jasmine shifted awkwardly, still feeling the heat of embarrassment burning her skin. She adjusted Dominic in her arms, hesitated for a moment, then glanced up at Theodore. "Aren't you going home?" she asked timidly. His sharp gaze flicked to hers. "Why would I?" She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket wrapped around Dominic. The question she truly wanted to ask sat heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. "Doesn't someone important wait for you at home?" Instead, she let out a quiet sigh, turning her gaze back to her baby, pretending she wasn't wondering if his wife, or fiancé, was expecting him to return. "I'm going to take a shower," Jasmine murmured, stretching her sore muscles. She turned to Theodore, an amused glint in her eyes. "Please watch the baby, and if he wakes up, try not to scare him," she added playfully. Theodore shot her a scowl, his brows knitting together in mild irritation. She laughed at his reaction, shaking her head as she grabbed her towel and disappeared into the bathroom. By the time she stepped out, refreshed and wrapped in a loose, comfortable shirt, she was greeted by a sight that made her heart swell. Theodore was sitting in a chair near the bed, gently rocking Dominic in his arms. The baby's tiny fingers clutched at his shirt as he let out a soft sigh in his sleep. Jasmine felt warmth spread through her chest. She had never imagined seeing Theodore like this, cradling their child so tenderly. His usually cold expression softened in the dim light of the room. "Get some rest," Theodore said quietly, glancing up at her. "I'll take care of him." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." The moment her head hit the pillow, exhaustion claimed her. After days of barely sleeping, her body finally surrendered to the overwhelming need for rest. She didn't know how much time had passed when she stirred awake to the sound of hushed voices. Blinking groggily, she sat up, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the woman standing beside her bed. "Lillian?" she breathed. Her old friend's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Jasmine, how are you?" Lillian whispered, before rushing forward and pulling her into a tight hug. Overwhelmed, Jasmine hugged her back. "I'm mad at you," Lillian suddenly blurted, pulling away to glare at her. "You were supposed to call me, but you vanished. Do you have any idea how worried I was? If it weren't for my nephew ending up in the hospital, I never would have found out that you and my brother have a child." Jasmine winced. I'm sorry, I really am. I didn't mean to keep you in the dark." Lillian sniffled, wiping at her eyes before exhaling shakily. "Thank goodness we found you. We love you. Don't leave us again." Jasmine swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded. Lillian turned toward Theodore, her tearful expression instantly shifting to something more playful. "And you. Don't let Jasmine run away next time, got it?" Theodore merely gave a small nod, his eyes flickering toward Jasmine, unreadable as always. Before Jasmine could say more, she was enveloped in another warm embrace. Serafina, Lillian's mother, had joined them, cooing over the baby before holding Jasmine's hands tightly. A week later, Dominic was finally discharged from the hospital. As they stepped out, Jasmine inhaled the fresh air, ready to return to her small home and resume her normal life. But the moment she turned to Theodore, she was met with his firm, unwavering gaze. "You're coming home with me," he said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No discussions." Jasmine frowned. "But I have my store. I'm making a living there. I can take care of Dominic on my own." Theodore's lips twitched into something that almost resembled amusement. "I can give you as much money as you need," she huffed, crossing her arms. "I don't need your money. I can just borrow some if necessary. Dominic and I will be fine." At that, Theodore's smirk faded. His gaze sharpened, turning serious. "Jasmine, do you really want our son to grow up that way?" Her breath caught. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. She lowered her gaze, biting her lip. A few hours later, they arrived at Theodore's residence. The moment they stepped inside, he led her straight to a spacious bedroom. "This is your room now," he said, placing Dominic's things near the crib that had already been set up. "Don't argue." Jasmine sighed, resigned. Okay. Theodore nodded in approval. I have to go out for a bit. Mom and Lillian will come over later so you won't be alone. He hesitated for a moment before his eyes narrowed slightly. And don't even think about running off. She raised an eyebrow. Why would I? His expression darkened ever so slightly. Because I know you. That's why I have a guard stationed outside. Jasmine's mouth fell open in shock. The guard? Theodore snorted, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. You're good at disappearing. Jasmine ignored his remark, focusing instead on gently tucking Dominic into his crib. She stroked her baby's tiny hand, relieved that he was finally regaining his strength. After ensuring he was comfortable, she turned to the pile of clothes Olivia had sent over from the hospital the day before, everything neatly packed, as per Theodore's instructions. She began sorting through them, separating what needed washing. A little while later, Lillian arrived, her eyes immediately landing on Jasmine's domestic task. With a teasing grin, she folded her arms. Wow, already settling in? Did you two get married while I wasn't looking? Jasmine rolled her eyes. Don't start, Lillian. Lillian laughed, then leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. By the way, how did my brother end up being your client that night? Jasmine felt heat rush to her cheek. She froze, gripping a tiny onesie in her hands. I have no idea, she admitted, her voice barely above a murmur. Lillian smirked. You knew I planned to do that, so… I didn't plan for it to be him, Jasmine cut in, mortified. Lillian's smirk widened. Well, I may have mentioned it to Mom. She asked Theodore for money to help you outright, but apparently he had other plans, she giggled. I had no clue he had desires for you, Jasmine gasped. Lillian, oh, come on. Aren't you happy your secret crush liked you too? Jasmine's face burned hotter. Shut up, Lillian wasn't done. I'm serious. That night, he came home a total wreck. He kept asking me where you were and I had no idea. That's when Mom and I found out what he'd done. Jasmine's breath hitched. Mom lectured him, of course, Lillian continued. But do you know what he said? That he wanted you. That he'd always liked you. Jasmine's heart pounded painfully. She gripped the fabric in her hands tighter, afraid of what Lillian might say next. He tried looking for you, but you vanished. Then work took over, and time passed. But at least you managed to catch him while he was still single. Lillian gave her a playful wink. His ex tried crawling back, but he never took her seriously. Guess you and my brother were meant to be? Jasmine swallowed hard, her thoughts a chaotic mess. Had Theodore really said those things? Had he ever… You'll see, Lillian teased. He'll say it soon enough. But listen, when he confesses, don't answer him right away, okay? Jasmine snorted, forcing herself to scoff despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Don't be ridiculous. Lillian clapped her hands together. Oh, you're blushing. You're still so into my brother. Jasmine grabbed a baby shirt and hurled it at her. Stop it, you're insufferable. Lillian squealed, dodging the attack as she dashed toward the door. Just before she slipped out, she turned back with a mischievous grin. Hey, sis-in-law! Don't forget to wash my brother's underwear, too. Lillian, Jasmine shrieked. She grabbed another shirt, ready to chase after her, but froze in place. Because standing at the doorway, watching the entire exchange with unreadable eyes, was Theodore. Why are you hand-washing clothes? Theodore's voice carried a note of irritation as he leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. His sharp gaze flicked to the damp fabric in Jasmine's hands. There's a washing machine for that, and we can get Elliot's housekeeper to do it. Jasmine, kneeling by a basin, shook her head. These are the only clothes we have until I do laundry. I don't mind. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable stubbornness in her tone. The Theodore exhaled sharply, clearly displeased. His scowl deepened as he stared at her, his fingers drumming impatiently against his forearm. Finally, after a long pause, he said, I bought some things for you and the baby. They're in the living room. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. She quickly dried her hands on a towel and stepped out, curiosity getting the better of her. As she entered the living room, her breath hitched. The couch and coffee table were nearly buried under an array of neatly packed boxes and elegant paper bags. Baby clothes, plush toys, stacks of diapers, cans of formula. Everything she and Dominic could possibly need was there. Lillian, who had been lounging on the couch, immediately perked up. A smirk spread across her face as she sifted through the items. Well, you and Dad went on quite the shopping spree, huh? She reached into one of the bags and pulled out a delicate lace-trimmed bra, wagging it in the air. "Ooh, I see new underwear for Jasmine. Perfect size. Big plans for baby number 2? Jasmine's face burned. "Lillian!" she shrieked, grabbing a pillow and hurling it at her friend. Lillian dodged with ease, laughing. "Hey, I'm just saying, my brother here went all out. Better make sure he's investing for the long haul." She turned to Theodore with mock seriousness. "You'd better catch her properly, big brother. You can't just assume she's head over heels." Then she gasped dramatically. "Oops, sorry, that slipped out." Theodore, who had been watching Jasmine's reaction, smirked. She was blushing, which was all the confirmation he needed. Jasmine, flustered, let her gaze wander across the pile of gifts until she spotted a small, unassuming paper bag tucked among the larger packages. The logo of an upscale jewelry store was printed in gold on its surface. She hesitated, unwilling to reach for it. Jewelry? That was too extravagant. Before she could dwell on it, Theodore's mother stepped into the room, cradling baby Dominic in her arms. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead before shifting her focus to them. "So," she said, tone light but expectant, "what's your plan for the two of you?" The room fell silent. Jasmine's heartbeat drummed in her ears as she turned to Theodore. He met her gaze without hesitation. "If Jasmine agrees," he said steadily, "we'll get married." Jasmine's breath caught. Married? So soon? She hadn't expected him to be this direct. Lillian's delighted shriek broke the tension. "Jasmine can't even speak, she's speechless!" She clapped her hands together in exaggerated glee. Theodore ignored her, his focus locked on Jasmine. His expression softened as he stepped closer. "Do you not want to marry me?" His voice was quieter now, more vulnerable. "Don't you like me anymore?" Lillian, ever the troublemaker, snickered. "Yes, big brother, beg for it," their mother chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment, while Theodore shot Lillian a glare that promised retribution. Jasmine, however, felt frozen. Her mind was a storm of emotions. She looked away, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the hem of her dress. "Why do you want me as your wife?" she asked softly. Theodore didn't even pause. His voice was unwavering, filled with quiet certainty. "Because I love you." Jasmine's breath hitched. "I've loved you since you were younger," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "I never stopped loving you." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Jasmine swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Do you love me?" Theodore asked, voice tinged with something raw, something vulnerable. Jasmine bit her lip, nerves twisting in her stomach, but when she met his eyes, she saw the hope in them, the sincerity. "I love you too," she whispered. Before she could process the depth of what she had just admitted, Theodore pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. And in that moment, with the warmth of his embrace surrounding her, she realized. This was home, Lillian whooped, and their mother clapped her hands in delight, her laughter filling the room like music. Even baby Dominic, nestled in his grandmother's arms, let out a delighted coo, waving his tiny hands as though he too understood the significance of the moment. Theodore reached into one of the paper bags, his expression unreadable. Jasmine barely had time to react before he pulled out a small velvet box. He flicked it open, revealing a simple yet stunning ring that gleamed under the soft glow of the room's light. Without a word, he gently took her hand, his fingers warm and firm around hers. Slowly, he slid the ring onto her finger, his eyes never leaving her face. "I love you," he repeated, his voice steady, filled with conviction. Jasmine swallowed the lump forming in her throat. Her heart swelled, her fingers tightening around his. "I love you too." They married at City Hall soon after. It was a quiet, intimate ceremony, just family and a few close friends. Theodore spoke of wanting a grand church wedding someday, but Jasmine had only smiled, saying there was no rush. Life moved forward like the turning pages of a book. She learned that her father and Aunt Lyra had sold their old house and disappeared to an unknown place. There was no word from them, no forwarding address. Jasmine could only hope they had found peace, perhaps even a little kindness, in whatever new life they had chosen. Olivia, too, had found her own happiness. She had married her foreign boyfriend and was now waiting for a visa so they could begin their life together in America. As for Jasmine, her world became Theodore and Dominic. But Theodore, ever determined, wanted more for her. He enrolled her in a 2-year hotel and restaurant management program, insisting she deserved the chance to continue her education. Though he had encouraged her to pursue a full college degree, she chose the shorter course. Her priority was her family, and she wanted to be present for every moment with them. The years passed in a blur, filled with late-night study sessions, baby giggles, and stolen moments with Theodore. Then, at last, graduation day arrived. The auditorium buzzed with excitement, the air thick with applause and the rustling of graduation gowns. When it was Jasmine's turn to walk across the stage, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. But before she could reach for her diploma, Theodore appeared beside her. He took her hand and stepped onto the stage with her, his presence a silent but powerful declaration of his unwavering support. As they stepped off the stage together, he leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Congratulations, babe," he whispered, his voice warm with pride. Jasmine beamed up at him, her heart swelling. "Thank you." Then, mischief danced in her eyes. "I have a surprise for you later." Theodore raised an eyebrow, curiosity sparking in his gaze. "What is it? Tell me now." She only laughed, shaking her head. "Patience." Later that afternoon, they arrived at a cozy restaurant for a celebratory lunch, where his mother and Lillian were already waiting. The scent of freshly baked bread and rich, savory dishes filled the air, making Dominic squeal in delight from his high chair. As they settled at the table, Theodore's mother grinned knowingly, her gaze flicking between them. "So," she said, her voice full of mischief, "when are you going to tell everyone that I'm getting another grandchild?" Jasmine froze mid-bite, her cheeks turning an unmistakable shade of crimson. Theodore, however, nearly choked on his drink. He turned to her, eyes wide with shock. "You're pregnant again? You didn't tell me?" His tone was a mix of laughter and mock scolding, though the joy in his eyes was undeniable. Jasmine shrugged, attempting an innocent look. "Guess my surprise is ruined." Theodore let out a deep, heartfelt laugh before pulling her into a tight embrace, pressing a kiss to the side of her head. "Thank you, babe. I really want a big family." Jasmine leaned into him, a wide grin spreading across her face. "Me too," she murmured, already imagining a home filled with laughter, love, and the pitter-patter of little feet. The Air family, growing, thriving, and wrapped in love. Lillian cheered, their mother laughed, and even baby Dominic joined in with a bubbly giggle from his high chair, his tiny hands clapping in delight. At that moment, surrounded by the people she loved most, Jasmine knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. And that's how Jasmine and Theodore found their way back to each other, through love, resilience, and an unbreakable bond. This story reminds us that sometimes fate has a way of bringing people together, even when life pulls them apart. Love isn't just about grand gestures, it's about showing up, choosing each other every day, and building a future together. What do you think? Do you believe in second chances and fate bringing the right people together? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. See you in the next video.